Last week we saw him raised back to power. But today we're going to kind of see this reckoning coming between him and his brothers that has been brewing for a while. But what we're going to see today, the main theme that we're going to see throughout this passage is the effect of a good theology. Now, theology, most of the time we associate that with seminary. We associate that with pastors or scholarship of some sort or commentaries or study Bibles. But really, theology is just our understanding of God, of who God is, what God has done, what God is doing, what God has called us to do. And the reality is that each of us have a theology. Theology plays a big part in our understanding of the world. Even unbelievers have a theology. Most of the time they say that there is no God, or that in effect they are God. We are the ultimate determiners of truth and reality. But we all have that. We all have some sense of who God is, or what we think God would be like if he were to exist. And the reality is that what we believe about God affects and shapes what we believe and how we prioritize and how we treat others. It shapes our entire world. You know, there's you may have heard of him. If not, you've heard of him through Logan's son, Adoniram Judson. He was the first American missionary to be sent. He was sent to Burma, which is modern-day Myanmar. And when he was going, before he went, there was a lady that he loved dearly. And he wanted to marry her. He knew that this is what he was going to do. Most people thought he was insane for wanting to do this because they knew the risks and like, why would you want to go do something that crazy? And so, you know, for most guys, not for all, but a lot of times you'll have that conversation with your future father-in-law, right? That you're going to propose. You're going to ask his daughter to marry you. Well, Judson does it in a little unconventional sense. You may have heard this, I'm not sure. But here's the letter that he wrote to his future father-in-law. He says, I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world. Whether you can consent to her departure to a heathen land and her subjection to the hardships and sufferings of a missionary life, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all this in hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory with a crown of righteousness brightened by the acclamations of praise which shall resound to her Savior from heathens saved, through her means from eternal woe and despair? All right, how many dads would read that letter and say, yeah, take her? You know, having daughters now, that hits different. But obviously, either the father said yes or the judge said, well, I really didn't care anyway, because they ended up getting married. Right? And so they do. And just as, it's scary how accurate this letter was. Because it played out almost exactly like he warned his father-in-law. Because they go, and they're living in this place, and, you know, Judson eventually gets thrown into prison, and he gets tortured, and the only reason he survives is because his wife, Anne, is coming to the jail and bribing the guards and feeding him, and that's the only way he survived at all. And then a few years later, she dies. She gets sick from being in the jungle and dies. Never having to get to see her father again, so just like he proposed. So the question is, what made them do it? And you can read, you know, the stories of martyrs and missionaries and, you know, all the, you know, throughout history. And you always have to ask the question of why. Because he knew, like, it wasn't like that. blindsided when I went. I mean, he was talking about it up front. He did it because he believed that the Great Commission was real, that God was going to use it to save the nations. He was going to use it to save people, and he knew that. When you read the story of William Carey, they told him, it says, if God's going to save the heathen, he's going to do it without consulting you or me. And William Carey said, no, he's not. He's going to do it through me. And he's going to do it through you. That's how he saves the nations. He only saves it by people going. And so the reality is that our theology shapes that. Because if we are like those people that were talking to William Carey, that said, well, God's going to save him some other way other than through me and you. He can do it on his own. If we believe that, then we're not going to go do anything. Like missions are not going, they're going to be low on our priority list. We don't care. We're not going to send money to that. Well, there's plenty of people here, and that's what we hear. Like, we hear it all the time. And it's probably, and if you say it, like, I'm going to tell you, it's the most annoying thing I've heard. I hate it. Like, there's plenty of people around here to save. There's plenty of people here that need Jesus. And that's true. And you're absolutely correct. I don't want every Christian to go, because they can't all go. It doesn't make any sense. If we're just going to pick up, all move to Myanmar or India, that doesn't, okay, this is a lost nation now. There are going to be people that remain, but you can't say, I'm going to do one with the exception of the other. It is a both and. You're called to raise up disciples in all places, in all nations. And so what they believe and what you believe affects how you live. For instance, if you say, corporate worship is a priority for me, but when you do your weekly schedule, it's the first thing that cuts when things get busy. Like, hey, I need an extra hour of sleep. We're going to cut Sunday mornings. Or if it's missions and you're saying, yeah, but if I just had a little extra in the budget, if I have extra, I'll give to that. Or whatever it may be, if you're constantly taking out time from the things you call your priorities, it's not really a priority. If you believe corporate worship is important, you put it at the top. It's the first thing. You build your weekly schedule around it. But if it's not, then you're like, okay, well, if I have extra time, I'll go. But if I don't, well, we're going to do something else. But beyond that, what we see through this story, what we see through Joseph's story, is how our theology shapes how we treat others. And ultimately, how it shapes those who are our enemies. So let's go back a little bit. Just go back to the beginning of the story of Joseph. Just kind of recap his life. No, he's born. He's the first one to Jacob's favorite wife, Rachel. He's the firstborn of them from her, and quickly jumps straight to the top of Jacob's favorite list. Now I know as parents like you never have favorite kids, but Jacob did. And he was unashamed about it. He was very vocal about it. He gave him a special coat. So he paraded him around. This guy is my favorite. Well, of course, the other brothers, they didn't like this. They weren't big fans. And so then to top things off, Joseph has this dream that all his brothers are coming to kneel before him. And, Joseph, young guy at this point, and he goes and tells them, hey man, I just had a dream that you guys are all going to come bow down to me. Went over like a lead balloon, right? It just didn't go over well. They didn't like it. So what do? So, all right, let's kill him. Let's sell him. Great idea. So, and I'm sure we've all thought about that with our siblings. Like, let's just get rid of him. It'll be easier that way. But they actually did it. So they sell him. He goes to Egypt, ends up becoming one of the high-ranking officials in the house of Potiphar. Once again, God's raised him up, put him in this seat of honor. But then, as we said, Potiphar's wife comes in and says, lie with me. And he's like, no. And she says, said, okay. So she runs and she steals his coat. And so he's running through the streets of Egypt. And Potiphar comes home. She says, look, he tried to lie with me. You brought this guy in. Like, what have you done to me? I screamed and asked for help. And she lied on him. And so then, what does Potiphar do? Throws him into prison. Well, what happens next? He raises the power. He's over the entire prison as a prisoner. And so he does this. Interprets his dreams and says, hey, just don't forget when you get to Pharaoh. You know, the cupbearer didn't. The baker probably didn't forget him. But he died, so it didn't help. But the cupbearer, he forgot him when he got to Pharaoh. When he was in the presence of Pharaoh, he said, I forgot about this guy. But then Pharaoh has a dream. And so he said, oh yeah, I remember that guy now. Me when I go get him, he told me my dream and it came true. And so I'd listen to him. So he does, and then we just where we're on the story. He is second in command of essentially the entire world almost of Egypt. He's only below Pharaoh himself. And so he has interpreted this dream for Pharaoh and says, there's going to be 7 years of harvest and 7 years of famine. Okay? So fast forward, he's interpreted that dream. There's been approximately about 9 years that have passed. They've had the 7 years of plenty. And now they're in the second year of famine. Well, the famine has officially hit Canaan, where Jacob and all his brothers were living. And then, so we're going to start in 42. We're going to summarize most of this. The goal is to get from 42 to 47 today. So the goal is to summarize this the best we can. I would encourage you, when this is over, go back and read this story. Like, it's just phenomenal, like, how all of this has worked out. When you read from 37 to 50, like how God orchestrates all of this. So, where we are now is they are in Canaan. Jacob is looking around and is like, guys, we're about out of food. Like, we're going to starve very soon if we don't do something. I've heard rumors that there's plenty of food in Egypt right now. Why don't you take everything, take our wagons and load up everything, and take some money and go buy as much as you can. And I say, okay. And so they do. And they go, but the only exception is they left the youngest son, Benjamin, Joseph's only full brother. And so they're going, and they come into Egypt, and Joseph is the one they encounter. Which, about this point, about 22 years has passed. So they haven't forgotten about it. You'll see the guilt is still weighing on them. But at this point, they're assuming he's dead. And they're definitely not assuming that he is a high-ranking official in Egypt. Like, they didn't expect this. So they come in, and they go, but Joseph recognizes them. You remember the people that sold you into slavery. You don't forget that face, right? And so he's looking at them, and they're like, yeah, we just need some food. And he's like, I don't think that's true. I think you're spies. Whoa, he's like, whoa. That's not us. Like, we're honest men. And anytime somebody had to tell you that they're honest, it's like when they tell you how humble they are. You're always a little skeptical. And that's kind of what they're doing. And so they come in, we're honest men. We're the brothers are all of one man. And we had one brother, but he is no more. And then our youngest brother is back home with our father. And Joseph's like, nope, you're all spies. I don't trust you. And he says, here's what I'll do. Leave one of your brothers here and go back and get your youngest brother and bring him to me. And he said, my dad's not going to love that idea. The other one's already died. This would be really hard on my dad if he comes here and dies. And so, but they go back and forth, and most suspect that Joseph was doing this because he wanted to make sure that the same fate that he experienced hadn't happened to Benjamin. He wanted to make sure Benjamin was alive. As you'll see, he clearly has a deep affection for Benjamin as the story goes on. And so he brings them in, and so they finally agree. So, okay, Simeon's going to stay behind. The rest of us are going to go back. And so he sends enough money, or he sends them plenty of food, and then he sends them back with all the money. And so then they don't realize until they're on their way back, and they say, oh no, we forgot to pay this guy. You're talking about a guy that has the power has an innumerable amount of options of what he could do to you at this point. That you just stole basically from Pharaoh himself. And so they're on their way back, like, oh man, what have we done? This is God's judgment for doing what we did to Joseph, and they're freaking out. And so they go back and they tell Jacob, and he's like, hey, here's what he said. He said, we got to take Benjamin back with us. Jacob's like, are you kidding me? He said, I've already lost one son. You left one of them in Egypt, and now you want my other favorite? Are you kidding? There's no way. But the same thing happens. Eventually, they run through the food, and they have to go back. And so then they're having this discussion with Jacob, and Reuben steps in and he's like, look, if I don't bring Benjamin back, you can kill my sons, which is not the best offer. Like, hey, kill your grandkids if you don't bring your son back. But that's what he offers. And Jacob's like, you know what? Just take me. But just know that if he dies, it will kill me. And so they head back, and they're, like I said, they're nervous. Like, they're already skeptical. Like, well, when we get there, we'll tell them what happened and about the money, and we'll pay extra. And we'll do all these things to make sure that he knows we're not trying to steal from him. And so then they get there. Joseph sees Benjamin coming, and he is thrilled. So he tells his servant, he says, go slaughter an animal. We're going to feast. And we're talking about a feast in the middle of a famine going on. So this is a big deal. And when the brothers hear about this, they get nervous. They're like, this is where it's coming. He's going to kill us. This is his moment. This is when he's going to pounce on us. This is for stealing. They still don't know it's Joseph. So they go to the guard, or they go to one of Joseph's servants. They're like, hey, look, that money was left in there. We didn't need to take it. And the servant tells them, like, it's okay. We sent it back with you. And they're like, oh. And so they're really suspicious at this point of what's going on. So then they come in and they feast, and Benjamin gets 5 times what the other brothers get. Like I said, nepotism is not a problem for them. They do not care about it at all. But so they do all this. They have this feast, and then they're about to be on their way with all the brothers. But then Joseph says, hey, place this is his special cup. So it was used for practicing divination. And then he says, put this in the the bag of the youngest. So he puts it in there. Some of this, you got to wonder, how much of it is yeah, I'm going to at least get you back a little bit. Just kind of that's exactly what I did with my brothers. But he puts this in there, and then they're on their way, and they act like they caught this cup being stolen, so they go and track them down. And they're like, oh my goodness, what have we done? Who stole it? None of us stole it. And then they find it in Benjamin's sack, and so they bring it back again. And then while they are there, Judah comes, and he's like, look, he said, take me, because if Benjamin does not come back, or I think he said, take us all. And he says, because if Benjamin doesn't come back, my father is going to die. And he says, and Joseph's like, nah. He said, I'm only going to take the one that stole the cup. He said, well, it doesn't make any sense for me to punish all of you. Just leave Benjamin here with me. And then they're like, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. And then we go into verse 45. 45 is where we're going to spend a big chunk of our time today. We've brought it all the way to this point that this drama has been building, and now we're in chapter 45, and Joseph loses it. Not in a bad way, just emotionally. He breaks down. breaks down in tears. He sends everybody out. So let's read it. Verse 40, chapter 45. He says, "Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, 'Make everyone go out from me.' So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?' But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence." All right, put yourself in their shoes right now. All right? You know, you're expecting this judgment to come upon you. You're expecting like there to be a reckoning for what you did to Joseph back in the day. You really don't expect it to come from Joseph himself. So they're sitting there, and all of a sudden, they recognize him. Because, well, one, he tells them who he is, but then they see it, right? I mean, just completely stunned silent. Which, I can't imagine I would react in any other way. Because every conceivable thought is running through your head at this point. And you don't know what to say first. Because you know if you say the wrong thing, he's just going to kill you on the spot. And he should. And then they're like, what? You're Joseph? All this time? And then Joseph said, in verse 4, he said, "So Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come near to me, please.' And they came near. And he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, for there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father, and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry. You shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children and your children's children, and your flocks, your herds, and all that you have. And there I will provide for you, and there are yet 5 years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have do not come to poverty. And now your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father of all my honor in Egypt, and of all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down. Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept. And Benjamin wept upon his neck, and he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. After that, his brothers talked with him. Would you love to hear that conversation? They talked. That's probably the perfect way to put it. It's because so these brothers, I mean, they've been carrying this burden for all of these years with the expectation that Joseph was dead. And then when they finally hear that this is Joseph, like they expect this punishment to be severe. Because what we see in these chapters is this, that when they came initially to Egypt, they came and bowed to Joseph, just like Joseph's dreams. And so I'm sure that was not lost on them at this point. But then they are waiting. You're just waiting for the hammer to come down on you. And you're waiting for your sentence to be carried out. And the whole time you're thinking is like, well, why did he just feed us? Why did he send us home with food? Why hasn't he killed us yet? And I'm sure none of the things they had in there was like, man, he's really over this. Like, I'm sure that suspicion was there for a long time. But the whole time he says, I am your brother Joseph, who you sold me in Egypt. And do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. It was Joseph's understanding of God. He says, God, I'm not giving you any of the credit. Don't get me wrong. But I'm not blaming you either. Because Joseph probably had no plans to go to Egypt. It was not on his radar. He wasn't, had no thoughts of it. But he got sold there, ended up there anyways. Joseph was able to see the bigger picture. Now, we don't know all the thoughts that Joseph had and all the conversations he had over the last 22 years. Like when he was in the prison, or he was in the bottom of the pit, or he was on the wagon with the slave traders. We don't know what he was thinking. I'm sure there were moments of like, God, I hope you have a really good plan. Because this is not the route I was going to take. I would have walked here if you had told me. But God, over and over and over, demonstrated his power in the life of Joseph. He demonstrated how awesome he was by continually, even though Joseph was sinned against, he was raised back to power. At no point in this story do we hear Joseph whining about anything or crying or, well, God, why are you so hard on me? Why don't you make it easier? You don't hear that. You don't read Joseph's voice in that way. And there's no reason to. He could see the bigger picture. He understood that God had something much bigger in mind than what he could have ever imagined. And he trusted God throughout this process. Like I said, we're talking 22 years. And a big chunk of that is prison and slavery and all these different components. Like it wasn't all like we're just sitting in this palace. Joseph had a rough life. But when given the opportunity for revenge against his brothers, for those who had wronged him, I mean, because really, he could have went back to any of them. He could have probably went back to Potiphar's wife and said, look, that's not what happened. Let's take care of this now. He probably could have went to the cupbearer, hey man, you forgot me. Now you're going to pay for it. He could have went to all the brothers, executed them one by one. But Joseph's ability to show grace in the midst of this came only from who he understood God to be. Because he understood God as a gracious God. That God is a good God and a loving God and a kind God. And so therefore, I'm going to be that to you, to all those who have wronged me. He was able to forgive. And not in the sense of like, I forgive you, but like, we're not going to be friends anymore. No, this is a Christ-like forgiveness. In the sense of like, no, I forgive you, and I'm welcoming you in. I'm bringing you in with me. Come, settle in this land, and I will make sure you have all the food. I'll make sure you have everything you want. Anything I have is yours. So put yourself in these shoes. How many grudges are you holding on to that are far less severe than his? And the question is, what do you believe about God? Do you think God is saying, well, yeah, you probably owe them one? Or do you think God's sovereign over it all? Like if you read the book of Genesis, like God's sovereignty is everywhere. And we see it now because you get the bird's eye view, you get the whole story. But when Abraham was called to follow God, he had no idea this is where it was going to end up. He wasn't even sure he was going to have a son. But God told him he was, and so he was faithful and he trusted that promise, and he eventually had Isaac, and then Isaac eventually had Jacob, and then Jacob had his 12 sons, which became the 12 tribes of Israel. But we can see that now because we see the full picture. We see the rest of the story of Genesis. We see the rest of the Old Testament, New Testament, and 2,000 plus years after that. But what is going on in your life now that you're like, God, you really just don't know what you're doing? Like, you need to figure this out. Because I'm stressed, I'm anxious, because I don't know what to do. Like I'm nervous about this, like this person wronged me, like I got to get them back. They can't do this to me. No one's going to wrong me this way. Or are you able to step back and see that God, you are over all? There is not a pin that drops that you are unaware of, that you are not sovereign over. There is not a drop in the ocean that falls apart from the will of God. Does your life reflect this? Or do you find yourself in this constant state of worry and fear and hatred towards others? Like, what is your life characterized by? How do you view life? Now, I say this, like, this is not meant to beat you up. Because there are moments, like, because there is still this war within us from our flesh that says, but God isn't going to. But is God really that good? Or did God really say? We face that battle. But which one are you leaning into? Which one do you find yourself leaning to? Do you really believe the promises that God has made? And Jesus says, cast your burdens onto me. Do you trust that He'll hold them? When someone deserves a reaction from you, are you giving it to them? Or are you like, no, God's got this? Because if you look at the life of Joseph is able to forgive because he understood who God was. He understood what God was doing. Now, it may have taken him a long time to get there. It may take a while for this to come full circle and him to see the final picture. And there was a lot of waiting. They said 22 years of waiting is a long time. Joseph could have went one of two directions with this. He could have spent 22 years building resentment and hardening his heart towards his brothers. Or he had 22 years to get over it. I've probably held on to much less grudges, much less serious grudges than this. In fact, I've never had anybody offend me in quite this way. But are you able to let it go? As we have seen, Joseph showed them grace upon grace upon grace. Because he knew that God was over it all. And he was able to endure the things that he was facing. He was able to withstand the trials. He was able to withstand the waiting. Because he knew the promises that God had made to him and to his ancestors. But let's step back even further. We talked about the bird's eye view of Genesis. Well, what's the big picture of all of this? Joseph doesn't really, beyond this story, and Joseph's kind of a minuscule character in the grand theme of the Bible. It's a very small portion. There are much more significant characters in here that have a much bigger role to play going forward. So what was the point of this? What is the point of this story? Why does God send Joseph to Egypt? Yes, it was to preserve the people. But more specifically, it was to preserve one, or two, or three. It was to preserve one bloodline. And that was the bloodline of Judah. Judah was the one that the bloodline was going to come through, the lion of the tribe of Judah was going to come through. He was the one that God was preserving the lineage of Jesus. I can't give you the whole genealogy to Jesus, but Judah was a big part in that. He was the next step. And it was his sons, and their sons, and their sons, and their sons, and their sons that ultimately bring us to Jesus. That as we're going to see, as we finish out this book, we're going to see the blessings that come upon the families, and come upon Judah specifically. And Judah is a name that is referenced over and over throughout, even the Old and New Testament. We talked about it, if you're going to pick one, if I was going to pick a character out of the Old Testament to be the bloodline for Jesus, Judah would not have been my pick. It would have been Joseph, most likely. Joseph's the coolest, maybe Benjamin, because at least he hasn't done anything real stupid that we know about. But Judah does it over and over and over and over and over. But God still preserved the bloodline because there was something much bigger at stake. And the reality is that what you are facing has much bigger ramifications than you realize. Now, I can say this with confidence, you are not going to be in the bloodline of the Savior. Okay? Your children are not going to be the Savior, I promise. It's already happened, so not that significant. But do you really hold on to the promise that God works all things together for good for those that love Him and are called according to His purpose? Because, man, when things are going good, that is a great promise to rest in. But man, when times are hard, you've lost your job, or you've lost a spouse or a child, or whoever it is, or someone has wronged you, and it is just weighing on you. God, I don't see the good in this. I don't see what you're doing. Sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's a month, or a year, or a decade, or a lifetime before you even get to know what God is doing. And that is hard, but that's where our theology matters. Because what we understand about God dictates all of that. Because if we don't understand who God is and what God is doing and that God is sovereign, if we think God is some weak, mandy-pandy God that's just sitting on a cloud playing a harp, then we're not going to risk our lives to follow Him. We're not going to put it all on the line for His sake. Because who cares? I can beat that dude up. Why would I follow a God like that? But if we really believe, especially as we get into Revelation, you're going to see a different version of what we talked about, not from the rest of the Bible. But you're going to see this version. He's a bad dude. You don't mess with this guy. He'll take you out in a heartbeat. He is not weak. He is not powerless. If He wanted to, with the blink of His eye, with a word, He could wipe us all out. God is over all of creation. And even in the moments it doesn't feel like it, in the moment it looks like the world is falling apart, and your candidate didn't get elected president, and the economy's not where you want it, and you hear all these wars across the globe, and it feels like the whole world is crumbling around you. God is still over it. Every single time. And God has provided a way for you. As I said, He provided this bloodline through Judah. As we get into chapters 46 and 47, we're going to hit these kind of quick. There's a lot of genealogies here, kind of who went to Egypt. There was a whole bunch of them. It was all of Jacob's kids and grandkids, and all of them came with them, and their herds and their livestock, and everything that they had was brought with them. But then finally, it took a little convincing to convince Jacob that Joseph was really still alive. Because he's like, don't don't mess with me, guys. My heart can't handle this. But he's like, okay, I believe you. My son is still alive. I'm going to go meet him one more time before I die. And so they pack up everything and go, and then they meet. And, Jacob is, and I don't even know if there's a word to describe it. When you think your child has been dead for 20, your favorite child has been dead for 22 years, and you've been stuck with these other boneheads, I cannot imagine what that feeling must have been like. To hold him. What you thought was one last time. But they come and they choose the land of Goshen, and they move in, and Pharaoh says, whatever they need, it's theirs. Joseph has been so good to us. And they've brought them in, they've settled them there, and they've given everything they need. But as the famine continues to go, this is just more of an interesting side note than anything. Just as we go forward, as you read forward in your own time more than anything. But the Egyptians start to run out of food. And they've already spent all their money. They bought all the food that they can. So they come in, and they're like, hey, we don't have any more money, but we need food. So they, okay, just give us your land, and we'll give you some seeds, but the land will all be ours. And then you're basically going to be our servants. Okay, so the Egyptians start off as the servants, and eventually at some point, and Joseph enlists them as the servants, and then at some point, Israel becomes the servants of Egypt, and then that's when we get to the Exodus story. And they stay there for about 400 years, and then we come to the Exodus story where God brings them out of slavery, brings them back out of Egypt. But they brought all this, and then at the very end of 47, he says, in verse 29, he says, and when the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, if now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. He answered, I will do as you have said. And he said, swear to me. And he swore to him. Then Israel bowed himself upon the head of his bed. So the first thing, Jacob, Israel has realized, like, okay, it's time for me to die. He's 147 years old. So he's getting up there. And he wants to come, he tells Joseph, come to me. And he blesses him. And he tells him, here's how I want you to be. And so we're seeing this changing of the guard, this end of an era kind of thing. And we'll, as we see at these last few chapters, how this finally plays out. But what we see throughout this whole thing is that Joseph's theology changed the world. It shaped how he treated those who wronged him. It made him gracious. It made him generous. It made him forgiving. It made him kind. How does your theology shape you? What are you passionate about? Is there anything within the church that you're passionate about? Is there anything about God's kingdom that you're passionate about? Because if there's not, well, one, you may not be a believer. Or two, you need to do some deep soul searching. But the reality is that we're all passionate about different things. And that's okay. Because that's the beauty of the church, is that the church is different, it is diverse. Now we should care about all of them. It is important that we care about missions, that we care about our local community, we care about international missions and state missions, and it's important that we care about our Sunday morning gathering and how we preach the word and how much we pray. We should all care about every aspect. But there's going to be some that you are more passionate about than others. And there's going to be some that you're going to be the driving force behind. Is it your hospitality? Is it how forgiving you are and how kind you are and how loving you are to those around you? What is your life marked by? If people were to ask you, well, what do you believe about God? What would you tell them? And then if you looked at your checkbook and your schedule, would those two things line up? If we ask your friends those things, those attributes that you would give to yourselves, would they agree? They say, oh yeah, she's generous. Or he's helpful. Or man, that guy really cares about Jesus. Or he really loves missions, and it's all he talks about, and it's all he thinks about. What is it that characterizes who you are? What is your understanding of who God is? How does it shape you? How does it shape your life? If, today you're sitting here and you're like, I have no idea what I believe about God. I don't know what it's done for me. I think it's a little messed up. We want to talk to you. Because our goal is not to condemn you. Our goal is to help you to get where you want to be. Where God is calling you to be. Because God's grace is extended to you. Because the reality is that we are in this. Because even what Joseph's brothers did to him, we have done far worse to God. But God says, come to me in this. He says, I sent my son, and I sent him to die for you. So that we can have this moment. So that you can come and eat this feast with me. That you can come sit at this table with me and join in with me and rejoice. Your sin is not too much. Jesus was enough. Let's pray. God, thank you. Thank you for your word. Thank you just for the goodness that you show us. That you have drawn us to yourself, that you have made yourself known to us. God, I pray that you will be magnified today. That you will show us who you are. Help us to have a correct understanding. Help us to open your word and to seek and search it out. That we know you and what you have called us to in our life. Be with us tonight. In Jesus' name. Amen.
You're good, Stan.